The Spanish Civil War is probably the most significant war between the First and the Second World War. After all, a significant number of modern weapons and concepts were used, and three major powers of the Second World War directly sent combat units, namely Germany, Italy, and the Soviet Union. The war also was not a minor affair. About 500,000 to 600,000 people were killed, and it was covered extensively by the media at the time. Thus it is quite interesting what some major powers did not learn, and also why they didn't learn. Because the reasons were quite different for each one. This video will take a look at the United Kingdom, France, and the United States. So hold on to your tea, baguette, and AR-15. First off, some important events from the Spanish Civil War that provide valuable lessons. From July to September 1936, the first successful major military airlift was conducted by the Legion Condor. About 16,000 troops with weapons, artillery, and armor were flown from Spanish Morocco to the mainland of Spain. In March 1937, the Battle of Guadalajara took place. In this case, Republican air units, mainly Soviet fighters and bombers with Soviet pilots, struck the logistics and reserve units and routed two Italian divisions. And in March 1938, the Italians conducted a series of bombing attacks against Barcelona, which caused severe damage and about 2,000 civilian casualties. Yet the civilian morale in Barcelona did not collapse. Quite on the contrary, the resistance hardened. Note that the infamous bombing attack of the Legion Condor on Guernica is not mentioned here, because its military importance was less conclusive than the other events listed. Now let's look at the previously mentioned individual air forces. Let's start with the Royal Air Force. You might be surprised it was almost completely ignorant towards the event in Spain. The military historian James Corum notes that only one serious article in the official RAF journal, the Royal Air Force Quarterly, was published in July 1939, and it was a translation of a French article. It analyzed the air war in Spain and put an emphasis on the technological lessons, like the effectiveness of dive bombers and ground attack planes. Additionally, he mentioned the need for better bomber armament, bombs, heavier anti-aircraft guns, and better superchargers. There were of course other publications, like the Journal of the Royal United Service Institution and one article in the Army Quarterly. Yet in both journals the articles were not by British authors. The lessons mentioned were rather similar: importance of ground attack operations, need for escort fighters, and limits of strategic bombing. Yet in general in the RAF, the lessons of the Spanish Civil War were mostly ignored. Now the question arises, how did the RAF hold up well in the Battle of Britain, if they ignored so many lessons from the Spanish Civil War? Well, one part was that the British built up the first, and at that time most effective strategic air defense system, which improved upon the system that was designed in the First World War against the German Zeppelin and bomber attacks on Great Britain. Second, the importance of ground attack and coordination with army units was not relevant during the Battle of Britain. The other lessons, like the bombers were very vulnerable to fighters, also were not an issue, because the British were on the defense. Additionally, a sufficient amount of money was spent into building up a fighter force, although according to Corum, the initiative for this came from the Parliament against the will of the RAF leadership. And finally, the British also took valuable lessons from the Battle of France. Which brings us to the French, and they acted quite opposite in many ways. They actually studied the war extensively. Yet at the start of the Spanish Civil War, French air doctrine was seriously lagging behind, since it was still mostly organized like in 1918. There was no concept of massed air power, fighter units were assigned to specific limited front lines, and support for the army was lacking in tactics. Yet the new minister initiated a major reorganization, which created three groups: one with a concentration of bombers, one with a concentration of fighters, and one for army support. Additionally, the Spanish Civil War showed the French the importance and possibilities of air superiority, and the doctrine was adapted properly. French officers noted the capabilities of German and Italian dive bombers. Furthermore, they were aware about the disproportionate effectiveness of anti-shipping operations by the rather small naval aviation units. In short, the French had a capable minister that reorganized the air force and plenty of officers that drew valuable lessons from the war in Spain. Now, if this is the case, why was the French Air Force Luftwaffe in 1940? Well, already in 1938 the new minister became the old minister, and the newer minister basically rolled back the major reforms. The offensive use of air power that had proven itself in Spain and had been emphasized by the French Air Force between 1936 and 1938 was played down, as General Gamelin insisted that the role of the Air Force was to be primarily defensive. Hence, when the Germans attacked in 1940, they faced a stale bread instead of a crispy baguette. Now how about the United States? Well, the US Army Air Corps did less than the French, but more than the British, which isn't necessarily a major achievement. Anyway, the Air Corps had a semi-official journal, the US Air Services, during that time. There were only a few articles from 1936 to 1939 on the air war in Spain. Yet in April 1937 there was a brief editorial that explained why no lessons from the war in Spain could be drawn. Now put on your protective gear. The fascists, halves, the editor maintained, would not allow the destruction of urban targets because it was inevitably their own property that would be destroyed. This surprising level of ignorance and naivety regarding the war in Spain seems to have permeated the Air Corps to the highest level. And just about a year later, in an editorial of May 1938, the Assistant Chief of the Air Corps dismissed the Spanish Civil War as irrelevant to modern war. Although the author noted that he was very impressed by the airlift conducted from Morocco to Spain and that airlifts will be an important aspect of future wars. Additionally, there was also an extensive article written that repeated some of these aspects, but also took a look at interdiction and the use of anti-aircraft guns, and other issues that were mostly on point. Yet the Air Corps' tactical school, which was the center of doctrinal thought, mostly ignored the Spanish Civil War. They were mostly focused on precision strategic bombing and assumed they could paralyze an enemy by hitting industrial centers. Since the Spanish Civil War offered little information on bombing industrial centers or major strategic bombing campaigns, the Air Corps Tactical School only covered it in a very limited way. Now, quite interestingly, the US Army other branches, remember before and during World War II the Air Force was part of the US Army and not an independent air force like the RAF or the Luftwaffe, took quite some interest in the Spanish Civil War. There were articles posted in the infantry, field artillery, coast artillery, cavalry and army ordnance journals. These articles usually focused on respective branch and were rather tactical and technical. Nevertheless, many articles emphasized the role of air operations and important lessons from the air war. Several army officers offered the conclusion, clearly unwelcome to the Air Corps, that strategic bombing of enemy cities and industries had no decisive effect in Spain and that the civilian populations had quickly learned to adapt to the bombardment from the air, a judgment that contradicted the theory of popular air power prophet Duhe. They also pointed out the effectiveness of fighter planes, the difficulty of precision bombing and the dangers of heavy anti-aircraft guns like the German 88mm flak. But it seems that the US Army Air Corps didn't really want to hear this. Or one could say they just wanted to be left alone in their own little safe space. Now some final remarks. The officers who authored the articles for most parts produced high quality analysis. Yet most lessons were not learned due to bad senior leadership and or service culture of the respective air force. For instance, the RAF was reluctant in questioning its doctrine and the attitude resembled more a conservative gentleman club. The ignorance throughout the vulnerability of bombers led to high losses in the early days of World War II and switched to night bombing attacks in order to reduce the losses. Additionally, in terms of ground support and air transport, major lessons were missed. The US Army Air Corps took note of the later, but besides that, many other lessons were lost. This was not due to the lack of interest from officers, but due to the agenda the Air Corps was pursuing. The Air Corps wanted the independent status of a separate service, and the precision strategic bomber doctrine of the Air Corps Tactical School gave the Air Corps a mission that could justify a service independence. As a result, the US Army Air Corps downplayed the importance of ground attack missions. Although the Air Corps was focused on strategic bombing, it missed how vulnerable bombers without escorts were, and the US bomber crews paid dearly for that, until proper escort fighters were introduced in sufficient numbers in World War II. For the French Air Force, the situation was quite similar. The officers were willing to learn and drawing a lot of important lessons from the war. Yet they were badly served by politicians and their commander-in-chief. Now Germany, Italy and the Soviet Union learned far better from the Spanish Civil War, but they also made their mistakes, and or couldn't exploit in some cases those lessons properly. But this is something for another video. Meanwhile, I highly recommend to you this video from Bismarck about the Stuka siren. Also make sure to check out his channel. Or maybe you want to learn more about Japanese bomber tactics, which is so far my best illustrated video. Thank you for watching and see you next time.